What if I told you that the most dangerous moment in Frank Sinatra's career didn't happen in a mob-filled backroom in Chicago or during a federal investigation, but under the blinding lights of the Copa Room at the Sands Hotel, armed with nothing but a microphone and a glass of Jack Daniels? That one night, the chairman of the board faced a threat that no amount of money or influence could fix. A moment of public humiliation that threatened to shatter the carefully crafted mystique of the coolest man on earth. Before we pour this drink and step into the smoky haze of 1966, make sure to hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell, because this is the story of how Frank Sinatra turned a disaster into a masterclass in power. By the way, tell me in the comments, which city are you watching from? Tonight, we are pulling back the velvet curtain on the untold story of The Silence at the Sands, a night that redefined what it meant to command a room. It was January 1966. The world of music was changing violently. The Beatles had conquered America, rock and roll was screaming through the radio, and the era of the tuxedo-clad crooner was supposedly dying. But in Las Vegas, Frank Sinatra was preparing to record what would become the definitive live album of his life, Sinatra at the Sands, backed by the thundering Count Basie Orchestra. The stakes were impossibly high. Frank was 50 years old. He wasn't just fighting for a paycheck. He was fighting for relevance in a world that was starting to call him a relic. The Copa Room was the center of the universe that night. 600 people were packed into a room designed for 400. Cigarette smoke hung in the air like a blue phantom, swirling through the beams of the spotlights. The clinking of crystal glasses and the murmur of high society conversation created a low hum of electricity. At the table sat the kings of industry, Hollywood royalty, and men with names you didn't say out loud. And in the center of it all stood Frank. He was moving through the upbeat numbers like a prize fighter. "Come fly with me. I've got you under my skin," swinging hard, proving that his voice still had the punch of a heavyweight. The crowd was eating out of the palm of his hand. It was perfect. Too perfect. But there was one man in the room who wasn't impressed. Seated at a prime ringside table, right next to the stage, was a man we'll call Mr. Vance. Vance was new money, loud money, a textiles magnate from out east who had spent the last 3 hours drinking expensive scotch as if it were water. Security footage didn't exist back then, but the memory of the maitre d' was sharp. He recalled that Vance had been making noise all night, laughing too loudly at the wrong moments, clinking his silverware during the quiet intros, acting like he owned the hotel just because he had dropped 10 grand at the baccarat tables earlier that afternoon. Frank had noticed him. Of course he had. Sinatra missed nothing. His blue eyes had darted to Vance's table twice during the opening set, a subtle warning shot that usually froze people in their tracks. But Vance was too drunk on his own ego to notice the predator watching him. The tension in the room was a thin wire, waiting to be snapped. If you love stories like this, subscribe for new stories so you don't miss the next chapter of music history. The shift happened when the orchestra slowed down. Frank signaled to Bill Miller, his pianist. The brass section faded out, the drums dropped to a whisper, and the lights dimmed until there was only a single pin spot on Sinatra. He sat on a stool, lit a cigarette, and prepared to sing the ultimate saloon song, Angel Eyes. This was the sacred part of the show. This was where the chairman vanished and the lonely man appeared. The room went dead silent. You could hear the ice melting in the glasses. Frank leaned into the mic, his voice a smoky whisper, singing, "Hey, drink up, all you people." And then it happened. "Pick it up, Frankie, we're falling asleep out here." The voice didn't just break the silence, it shattered it. It was Vance, leaning back in his chair, shouting with the arrogance of a man who thinks his ticket price bought him the right to direct the show. A collective gasp sucked the air out of the Copa room. 600 heads turned. The Count Basie band, professional to the core, faltered for a millisecond. In the world of Frank Sinatra, interrupting a ballad wasn't just rude, it was a capital offense. It was like spray painting graffiti on a church wall during a prayer. Frank stopped. He didn't look angry. Not yet. He looked confused, as if he couldn't believe a human being could be that stupid. The pianist, Bill Miller, stopped playing. The silence that followed wasn't the beautiful silence of a ballad. It was the terrifying silence of a bomb about to go off. Everyone knew Frank's temper. They knew about the fights, the thrown telephones, the sudden explosions of rage. The air in the room grew heavy, thick with the anticipation of violence. Men at nearby tables loosened their ties. Women clutched their pearls. Everyone waited for Frank to scream, to call security, to have the guy thrown out into the desert night. But Frank didn't scream. He slowly took the cigarette out of his mouth, placed it in the ashtray, and turned on the stool to face Vance directly. The stage lights caught the sharp angles of his face, making him look like a statue carved out of ice. He looked at the man for a long, agonizing 5 seconds. "You in a rush, pal?" Frank asked. His voice was low, devoid of the famous Sinatra charm. It was the voice of a guy from Hoboken who knew how to handle himself in a street fight. Vance, emboldened by the alcohol and the sudden attention of the room, didn't back down. "I came to hear the swinger, not the weeper," he slurred, laughing at his own joke. "Sing something with a pulse, old man." The insult hung in the air. Old man. He had called Frank Sinatra the king of cool, an old man in front of his orchestra, his friends and his fans. A ripple of nervous energy shot through the crowd. This was the moment where the legend could crumble. If Frank lost his cool, if he looked petty, if he screamed, he would prove the heckler right. He would look like an angry, aging star past his prime. The entire legacy of the night was hanging by a thread. But before we see how the chairman responded, subscribe for new stories to keep exploring the lives of legends. Frank stood up. He walked to the edge of the stage, towering over Vance, who was seated just a few feet away. Frank didn't look at the crowd. He looked only at Vance. He adjusted his cufflinks, a slow, deliberate movement that signaled he was getting down to business. "What's your name?" Frank asked, the microphone capturing the dry, deadpan tone. "Eddie," the man shouted back, sitting up straighter. "Eddie Vance." "Eddie," Frank repeated, tasting the name like cheap wine. "Well, Eddie, let me ask you something. What do you do for a living when you're not ruining my night?" "I'm in textiles," Vance bragged, puffing out his chest. "I run the biggest operation in Ohio." Frank nodded slowly, a small, dangerous smile playing on his lips. "Textiles? That's fantastic, Eddie. That's really beautiful. You make tablecloths. I make memories. We're practically in the same business." The crowd chuckled nervously. It was a jab, but a soft one. Vance didn't feel the sting yet. He smiled, thinking he was part of the act now. He thought he was winning. He thought he had dragged Frank Sinatra down to his level. "You got a lot of money in that pocket, Eddie?" Frank asked, his voice getting softer, drawing the room in. "Enough to buy this whole place," Vance boasted, waving a hand around the room. Frank looked around the Copa room, then back at Vance. The look in Sinatra's eyes changed. The coldness evaporated, replaced by something far worse. Pity. It was the look of a man who has seen everything, judging a man who knew nothing. "You know, Eddie," Frank said, leaning casually against the mic stand, looking like the coolest object in the universe. "You probably could buy this place. You could buy the booze. You could buy the steaks. You could probably even buy the suit off my back." He paused. The room was paralyzed. But there's one thing you can't buy, pal. Frank signaled to the band leader. Count Basie, sensing the moment, gave a tiny nod. You can't buy class, Frank whispered into the mic. And right now you're overdrawn. The reaction was delayed by a split second as the words sank in. Then, the room exploded. It wasn't just laughter. It was thunderous applause. It was the sound of 600 people realizing they had just witnessed a verbal execution. Frank hadn't raised his voice. He hadn't used a single curse word. He hadn't called security. He had simply used his presence, his wit, and his absolute authority to shrink Vance from a wealthy tycoon into a small, rude child. Vance's face turned a deep shade of crimson. The laughter of the room washed over him. He slumped in his chair, suddenly realizing that all his money was useless against the charisma of the man on stage. He had brought a wallet to a knife fight. But Frank wasn't done. And this is where the genius of Sinatra truly shined. A lesser performer would have gloated. A lesser man would have kicked Vance while he was down. But Frank Sinatra was the host of the party, and the party had to go on. He didn't want the night to end on a sour note of conflict. He wanted it to end on music. He held up a hand, silencing the crowd instantly. He looked down at Vance, who was now staring at his scotch glass, wishing he could dissolve into the ice cubes. "Bartender," Frank called out, pointing a finger at the shadows. "Bring my friend Eddie here another drink, a double, on me." The crowd gasped again. Mercy? After that insult? Frank looked at Vance, his eyes softening just a fraction. "Drink it slowly, Eddie. Listen to the music. You might learn something." It was the ultimate power move. By buying him the drink, Frank forgave him, but he also dismissed him. He turned Vance from an antagonist into a prop. He asserted his dominance not through force, but through generosity. He was the king, and the king could afford to be gracious to the jester. Before we get to the finale of this incredible night, subscribe for new stories if you want to see more moments of genius like this. Frank turned his back on Vance, effectively erasing him from existence. He walked back to his stool, picked up his cigarette, and looked at Bill Miller. "Where were we, William?" "Angel Eyes, boss?" "Right, Angel Eyes." Frank took a drag, exhaled the smoke towards the ceiling, and waited. He waited until the room was absolutely silent again. He waited until the memory of the loud, textile tycoon was gone, replaced by the melancholy atmosphere of the song. And then, he sang. And he sang it with a vengeance. The interruption had fueled him. The frustration, the anger, the need to prove he was still the greatest, it all poured into the lyric. "Excuse me, while I disappear." The reviews from that night said it was the best version of Angel Eyes he ever performed. It was raw, bleeding, and perfect. The audience was crying. They weren't crying just because the song was sad. They were crying because they had seen a man face a moment of public vulnerability and turn it into art. They had seen Frank Sinatra stare down the changing times, the critics and the hecklers, and win without throwing a punch. Vance? He didn't say another word for the rest of the night. He sat there, nursing the drink Frank had bought him, watching the man he had called old hold the entire room in a trance. When the show ended, Vance reportedly left a $500 tip for the waiter and slipped out the back exit, disappearing into the neon night of Las Vegas, a footnote in the legend of the chairman. This incident at the Sands became a whispered legend among entertainers. It taught every comic, every singer, and every actor in Vegas a valuable lesson. You don't fight the audience with anger. You fight them with style. You fight them by being so undeniably good at what you do that their insults bounce off your tuxedo. Frank Sinatra didn't just sing songs, he sang life. He understood that the stage was a battlefield, and the microphone was his weapon. That night in 1966 proved that while rock and roll might be taking over the charts, nobody could take over a room like Frank. He showed that true coolness isn't about being young or loud. It's about composure. It's about knowing exactly who you are when everyone else is trying to tell you who you should be. As the years went on, the recording of Sinatra at the Sands became a classic. If you listen closely to the album, between the tracks, you can hear the confidence in his voice, the swagger of a man who knows he has won. You don't hear Eddie Vance on the record. He was edited out of history. But his ghost is there in the intensity of the performance. He was the grit in the oyster that created the pearl. The next time you feel like you're being challenged, or someone is trying to shout you down, remember Frank at the Sands. Don't scream back. Don't lose your cool. Just straighten your tie, look them in the eye, and remind them that class is the one thing they can't buy. Subscribe for new stories to join our community of history lovers. Frank Sinatra's legacy isn't just in the high notes. It's in the silences. It's in the moments where he stood alone against the noise and made the world listen to him. And on that January night, he didn't just save the show. He saved the era of cool, at least for one more night. If this story gave you chills, make sure to hit that like button. And tell me in the comments, what is your favorite Sinatra song and why? Subscribe for new stories, and we will see you in the next video. The legend continues here.